What I'd like to do this morning is look at a variety of texts, not all literary texts. Some, but not all. And it won't be exclusive to biblical literature. In exploring sacred spaces, I'm going to take you underneath the city of Rome, where there's 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles of carved passageways that have niches where early Christians met. And in those niches, those early Christians, without resource, living in a world that was extremely oppressive politically, they were under an inordinate amount of pressure. They left various frescoes. It was the way they did painting and covered it over, and it's been preserved in time. And it represents a text, a window into what they were all about. I not only want to look at the earliest underground worship space, but I want to look at the oldest above-ground worship space that has been unearthed. In World War II, there was some moving around in the desert, in the Middle East, and in Dura Europa, Syria. It looked just like a big sand hill. Tanks went in there and boom, hit stone, and there was a lost city of Dura Europus. Eventually, the archaeologists got to it, pulled away the sand, and what was uncovered there, among other things, was the earliest above-ground church. And I'm going to take you there to look at some of the artwork there. Not only am I interested in looking at the earliest underground church and see what they did with worship space by working with visual text, not only am I interested in looking at the underground and the first above ground and looking at visual text, what I want to do is draw from material that was translated by James Charlesworth, who, as a professor of New Testament at Princeton University, actually in charge of the department, translated from the Aramaic a hymnal from right around the 1st century AD in Syria. And if you look at New Testament text itself, there certainly is an expression of the Jesus story. Now, what I'm interested in looking at his text, it's not canonical literature like the Bible, but as he introduced it, it represents the first attempts, the earliest attempts to articulate the Jesus experience by those who first were engaged by it and are engaging with it. So those things combined, you'll see, particularly when I look at the catacombs underground, when I take you there in Italy, then when I take you to Syria, above ground in Dura Europa. And by the way, that exhibit, Princeton University took an exhibit around the country, various museums, to give a window into it. It's such a fascinating find. You'll see when I do the underground church in Rome and the above ground one in Syria and show you some pictures. And then when we look at the Odes of Solomon, I think you'll see something in all of that that you might not be aware of. But I don't want to do that exclusively because it's a church, and I believe that a minister that presents to a pulpit should have an open Bible. And with that said, in looking at sacred space, which is what I have on the menu today, to look at sacred space and sacred literature. The word sacred, it comes from a Latin word for holy, a kadosh in Hebrew, harks to kind of set apart. What I want to do is just take a look on the quick at sacred space in the Older Testament. Briefly, I want to move to the New Testament in the Apostolic era, subsequent to which then I want to look at what's called the Sub-Apostolic era, looking at sacred space. Now, speaking of looking at sacred space, you're looking at an artistic rendition of Gan Eden in Hebrew, the Garden of Eden. And you're seeing a picture of Adam and Cheva, Adam and Eve. And there they are in what's referred to as paradise. The word paradise itself is a tacit reference to sacred space because it means enclosed garden. There's a sense in which if you look at you, mankind, you're looking at the story in a theological sense in biblical literature. They're placed in paradise. There's felicity, there's harmony, there's peace, there's rest. But eventually, in short order, their souls are going to become unrested. And even the concept of sacred space and rest is worthy of some consideration because the story of Gan Eden in Bereshit in Hebrew, in Genesis, comes on the heels of a creation story. In the first chapter, we're told, Bereshit bara Elohim hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We're told there's darkness, there's chaos, there's void. And then we're told, V'ruach Elohim marchefet al panei hamayim. The Spirit of God shows up and moves over the face of the water and brings order out of chaos. It brings a kind of restedness with creation, and this is the result of it. And then the chapter ends, Vayiklu hashamayim v'aretz v'kol tzva'am vayikal alehim al yom hashvi'i malachto asher asah. God worked 6 days, seventh day he rested. And there's a reference to a kind of rested state, subsequent to which then the narrative pitches to this, a picture of sacred space. Now, I would imagine to varying degrees you're familiar with the story, but let it be known as a reminder, it didn't work out so good. What happened is, all of a sudden, she's walking down the street and hears his voice, "Hey, lady." And all of a sudden, someone gets distracted. You read in the Genesis narrative that sin makes its entrance onto the stage of the human drama, and the human race is vitiated, it's defiled. There's shame, there's guilt, and there's this. Now, this is a story from Renaissance art. If you're familiar with Michelangelo, there's the story there, there's the tree, and you can see a serpent-type figure coiled around the tree. And there's Cheva there, there's Eve, and it kind of depicts the moment. Now, there's 2 points to it. There's the story where sin, you have that vitiation, that defilement, and then you have the aftermath. It's part of the same frame. On the other side of the tree, you have Adam and Cheva, not looking very blissful like you had over here. Oh, they're not just enjoying lunch. They just had a bad lunch, and they are working with shame, with guilt. And you can see there is a dagger, a sword pointed on Adam's neck, and there's a character there who's kind of flying in midair. It depicts a cheruv. Now, individuals hear the term cherub or seraphim. There's different language for angelic-type creatures in biblical literature. And then there's the generic, angelos in the Greek, or the verb malach, angel, just kind of a generic messenger. You have this seraph dressed in red, and you have this dagger, and what he's saying is, hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back no mo. If you can recall the end of the Eden story, God's not a happy camper. The royal couple are kicked out of Dodge. And the Genesis, the third chapter ends with Adam and Cheva pushed out to the east. And there are these cheruvim there, these angelic types, and there's a flaming sword. And the literature is explicit. It's not even tacit. It's not an inference. It's direct. It's explicit to keep them from coming back. So there's a sense, if you look at biblical literature, if you look at sacred space, it begins there. And you, mankind, is there in God's presence. There's a kind of there's felicity, there's peace, there's fellowship, there's communion. But it all goes south. Now, this is a simpler telling of it. You see an arrow there pointing away from the tree. And there's a depiction there of, if you look at these, and it's kind of like a corny depiction, I grant, but it tells the story. You have these cheruvim, these winged creatures. Now, by the way, you find this in the ancient Near Eastern world. The guardians to the temples. It's actually depicted in stone. In fact, you might recall the Sphinx. You have the Great Pyramid there, and there's this, this animal with a human head. I mean, there's different ways that the ancients picked up on these kind of angelic figurines. Well, you have this seraphim. These figures there, there's a path leading away from the tree, from the Etz Chaim, leading away from the tree of life. And you see the arrow pointed, they're out. And you can see there's this flaming sword there that's depicted. Don't come back. Well, they did come back. You might recall, as you kind of move on with the story a little bit, we're in the Far East, in the ancient Near Eastern world, at the edge of it, what would be modern Kuwait. And there's a fellow named Avram, to be known later more commonly as Abraham. there's this stirring. He leaves Ur of Chaldee, which is modern Kuwait. He travels along the Fertile Crescent, and the family hunkers down in Haran, Syria. But he's driven, he's beckoned by an impulse. Something inside of him wants to go to some land, some place. There's an urge to return to that place. There's something there. God says to him in the 12th chapter, according to the text, Avraham, lech lecha, go to the place that I will show you. I'm going to make your name great. And he says, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. That there's going to be some result of his going on the journey, taking that leap of faith, rolling the dice against an uncertain future, and going to that land. There's something about that place. Well, of course, in early Genesis, the Lord tells him, I'm going to give you an Am Gadol in Hebrew, a great nation. But by the time you get through Genesis, you're a little better than a little tribe. But eventually, through time and circumstance, this family populates. And finally, there's a king, there's assets, and it's time to build Hekol in Hebrew, a temple, also referred to as Beit HaMikdash, the holy house. If you'll go with me, please, in the scripture to 1 Kings chapter 6. And I just want to look at some descriptions here. What I'm getting to is finally the people of Israel are in the land, and David wanted to build a house, was told not to. His son Shlomo, or Solomon, which means peace, he is given assets, the wherewithal present to him, to then go about fabricating sacred space. And what I want to do here is just look at some of the descriptions of the sacred space. And then I want to make a connection. I think there's a nuance here that's worthy of some consideration. But if you look at the description of the house, we're told in chapter 6, verse 1 at the end there that he began to build the house. And we're told in verse 12 or verse 13 that it was the purpose of the build a house was, he says, that I may dwell among the children of Israel. There's building a house that God's Shekhinah, the Shekinah, would rest, that it facilitates a community around the divine. Now, I'm interested in the particulars of it here, as if I was an interior decorator, and if you will, please, this isn't going to be preachy, it's just some description, details. If you look in verse 20, pure gold is noted. In verse 21, it spells it out. Solomon overlaid the interior of the house with pure gold. In verse 22, the entire house. In verse 23, the inner sanctuary, there he made 2 cheruvim, 2 cherubs. Now I want you to remember that you might be familiar, you're going to see a picture in a moment of the Aron Kodesh in Hebrew, the Ark of the Covenant. If you're not familiar with it, go back and look at Indiana Jones in Search of the Lost Ark. There's a rendition of it there. There's this place where the Ark of the Covenant was placed, and you have these angels that are kind of leaning over it. But beyond that, like sentries, enormous sentries standing next to it, you have these angels. Now, what you're going to see here when you describe when the scripture describes the sacred space, what you're going to see is that it's fabricating Eden. That we're going back, and there's a kind of material reconstruction of that sacred space. If you look in verse 29, there's carvings on the walls on the interior with engravings of cheruvim. I'm going to show you a depiction of that in a moment, the way Jews construe it. And the interior of the house, everything's paved with gold, but you have these palm trees all over the place. You have these angels, these cheruvim. Carved engravings of the cheruvim, palm trees, flowers in both the inner and the outer room. He mentions in verse 30 that the floor is covered in gold. In verse 32, the double doors of olive wood, he carved on them carvings of cheruvim, palm trees and flowers. Now, trees, palm, flowers, flora, fauna, angelic figures. I mean, what it is we're constructing in a physical plant what we saw earlier in Eden. Well, this is the temple. Sacred space, in effect, was a a remanufactured Eden. Moving on. I want you to see it because a picture's worth 1,000 words. If you look at the number 9 there, it's pointing down to the Aron Kodesh, to the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, it's an artist rendition of it, but you can see, it was the best picture I could get you on the quick. You can see these angelic figures that are standing next to it like sentries. Now, right in this picture, you can't make sense of the walls around it. I'll show you that in a minute. But I want you to look at 8. There's a veil there that separated the holy place, which is where you can see the numbers 6 and 7, from 9, which is the Kadosh Kedoshim, the Holy of Holies. But I want you to see right by 7, you can see, if you look closely, I'll just call them candle holders right now so you can fix your eyes on it. It's called a menorah in Hebrew. There's a more formal term for it, candelabra. They didn't hold candles, they held oil. The room itself was full of these depictions of trees, angels, God's presence. Again, it's in gold in this case. It's kind of like a remanufacture of Eden. Here I'll show you another picture because it's rather telling. You can see at the very bottom, I have here a depiction of the holy place, and right over the O-N, you can see there's this little, it's an incense altar. You know the songs about, the incense and, entering to God's presence. You can see some priest is offering it up. And right there's a candelabra you can see. But I'm interested here in the walls. You can see palm trees everywhere. You can see these cheruvim, these guardian-type figures, these guardian angels. And all this is reminiscent of paradise. Even with the choice of the tree with palm. In fact, the palm, the word for a palm tree in the Greek, it's where you get the word phoenix from. And the image of the phoenixbird itself, that bird, was employed by the early Christians. And the reason why phoenix, and note the trees where the branches kind of protrude up and out. Now, that's not accidental. We'll get to that in a moment. But there are these palm trees that the ancients construed as representing immortality. Now, I want you to see this image. The temple was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. I want to fast forward now. If you will, never mind the Old Testament. Well, not never mind it as in I want to disrespect it, but I want to move beyond it. If you go to the Johannine Gospel, please. John chapter 4. There's a story here. Jesus is making his way about. And he encounters a woman who perceives that he's particularly insightful. There's this sense of a word of knowledge. She feels for good reason that, boy, he really knows me, secrets of my life and heart, and he's not condemning me. I mean, he knows, but he loves, and she perceives in that there's something divine associated with that. So she asks a question. She's in Samaria in proximity to where Steve Riggle was earlier when he took us to Bethel, which is in the West Bank. And Jesus is out in that part of the woods. And this woman presents and says, hey, some people say that if you want to really pray, if you want to do religion, you got to go to the temple in Jerusalem. And some people say, no, it's not over there, it's over here in the West Bank. And what do you think? She figures this is a prophetic guy. Where do I go to take care of this religious business if I'm inclined? And so she raises the question. Jesus' response is rather telling. You might be familiar with the verse. And the verse itself is an introduction to the art and the literature that I want to proceed to show you because I believe it's very telling. Well, certainly biblical literature is authoritative. I mean, this is the principal source. There's a Latin dictum, norma normans non normata. That is, that biblical philosophical statements need to be tethered to biblical principles as attested in the literature, not the imagination of a speaker. If you look in verse 23 in the 4th chapter, and you'd be familiar with this, the hour is coming, and it is here now. Oh, and by the way, even when Jesus says the hour is coming, even breaking down time into hours had just been invented before that. We're not working with our time much previous to that. In any case, that doesn't mean anything, but I thought I'd throw it in. The hour is coming, and it is here now, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such the Father is seeking people as his worshipers. She says, where do you go? The sticks and bricks. Which building has the right sign? Where do you go to get in touch with your boss? She perceives that Jesus is some prophet, and you and the divine have something going, so you tell me which house should I go to. And Jesus is on record saying, hold on for a second, realize something first. It's not about sticks and bricks. It's interesting, it seems to me. And he talks about worshipers. By the way, the word worship comes from two words, worth and ship. See, that's why I get paid the big bucks. I know how to put those things together. A ship of worth. As we make our crossing through life, there's an old Dutch proverb, God does not promise us an easy voyage, but he promises us a safe harbor at the end of it. There are road bumps on the highway of life. There are challenges. If any preacher tells you otherwise, it's just because he or she wants you in the church to keep the offering coming. If God has a call in your life, hell's gone an assignment against you. I'm sorry to tell you, I only work here. It's in the book. There's a thing called spiritual warfare. But worth-ship, that is to say, as you and I, as we make our journey from the womb to the tomb, we look at the Jesus story and the Jesus community, and we step into that because we think it's worth it. There's value in it, that as we make our crossing, we want to be part of the fellowship. That is, a bunch of fellows in the same ship. And worth-ship comes from that. In any case, so I want you to see here that Jesus gives voice to the fact that it's not just about sticks and bricks. She wants to know, where's sacred space? What church do I go to? Do I got to be a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, a Methodist? Who's got the phone number to the divine? Now, what I'm taking you to here is what I was mentioning earlier, which might differentiate a sermon like this from others, because what I'm interested in is in early Christian art and architecture. Parenthetically, by the way, I have a book. I forgot to promote it. If you're interested in early church history, I've written a few books on them. I have a few books in the out there in the foyer, but most of them my wife wrote, who's also she's a doctor of theology and New Testament studies. She couldn't be with us today, but some devotionals there, more to the heart than to the head. But if you're interested, visit. What you're looking at here is a picture from the catacomb. This is the catacomb of Priscilla. Now, you're looking at a woman, and I want you to pay attention to her overall, her stance, that kind of surrender, palms up, looking upward, kind of transcendent. Now, keep in mind that when you're in the catacombs, you're looking at individuals that are suffering, that the political context above ground is just, it's bombastic. People talk about secular and sacred. Sacred comes from a Latin meaning pertaining to the divine. Secular, by way of contradistinction, comes from a word meaning just pertaining to the here and now. The term secular itself isn't necessarily irreligious. It's just something else. But we're not just looking at a secular world. We're dealing with a profane world. It's not just that there are elements in it that are non-religious. It's just that it's bombastic. And what you're looking at here is you're looking at artwork from individuals in the earliest of Christian worship spaces in the world that we know of. And I want you to see, arms extended, eyes looking upward. There's a kind of transcendence. There's a kind of finding rest. This is in worship space. And it's not just there. And speaking of shipping, this is a depiction in the catacomb of Noah. Now, Noah's an Old Testament text from early Genesis, but you'll see here he is popping out of the ark, and you can see it looks like a smudge in the corner, but it's a dove. You might recall the story in early Genesis where the dove comes. And it's a sign, with the olive branch, and it's a sign of, okay, God's at rest. His anger is spent. Judgment is over. And it's a time of new beginnings. And, that kind of just presenting over. It reminds me of the early Genesis, where the first utterance of Scripture, the Spirit of God was hovering. It's kind of like, just hovering over, bringing new life. And here, you have this, we're borrowing an Old Testament text, and here's Noah in the ship. And I want you to note the posture of the arms. And we see this on a variety of occasions. It's not insular. It's not just a one-off. There's a word for this. It's spelled three different ways I know of. O-R-A-N, Oran, O-R-A-N-S, O-R-A-N-T, Oran. There's this posture of prayer. Now, you look in modernity today in church work, people go to a church and people are praying like this and somewhat transcendent, and people go, can't go to a church like that. I got to go to a real church. Those people are crazy. Everyone who is anyone knows this is nonsense. Well, nobody told the person that painted that picture that. If there's something wrong, if that's not the way it's done, whoever painted that didn't get the memo. Oh, I don't go for that new revival thing the crazies are into. Well, maybe it's not that new, and just because it might be new to you, I don't want to sound condemnatory in that, just because it might be new to you, I learn new things all the time. And part of just being an authentic human being is being open to the fact maybe we don't know everything. There's new things to learn. Well, here, just walk away with this. Don't take my word for it, but just listen to the art. I only work here. I mean, this stuff is, if you look at the experience of the first people that are participating in the Jesus story, and if you're just looking at the art, which is all that I'm doing here, just some art, not all of it. I'm going to pivot in a moment. But the art gives a window. I want to take you now to Syria. And what you're looking at is in apps. There's certain churches where, let's say, there's a fixed podium, and then there's paintings behind it, such that when someone is bringing the word, individuals are beckoned, hopefully, to pay attention to the message and the messenger, but likewise the art is telegraphing something, and it's, the apps is where everybody's focusing. I mentioned to you earlier Dura Europa, Syria, the earliest above-ground church, and what you're looking at here is the apps. You're looking at the wall. Now, it's barely visible, but if you can see in the middle, there is a picture of a man. Now, this man is wearing a Roman toga, kind of like a senator. And if you look close, you can see that his arm is sweeping. There's a sweeping gesture like this. It's someone dressed in a Latin toga going like this, beckoning someone, like a cop. Pastor Steve says, hey, the guy was a cop. I remember he called me one or two times. He called me. He says, Jeff, what are you doing? I says, well, I'm in a police chase right now. He says, well, what are you talking to me for? And I said, well, that's a good question. I'll call you later. Got to focus. I don't want to have to write another letter to the chief. Dear chief, sorry I wrecked your car. Okay, you got points. But the cop, you kind of give directions. Now, what happens is this person is giving a direction. Now, if you look off, you can see there's a picture of a man picking up a bed frame, a mat. Underneath it in the Latin, which I didn't show here because for as much as possible I wanted just to give attention to the two figures. Underneath it in the Latin, it says, rise, take up your pallet and walk. Now, what we're doing is we're quoting Jesus. Now, the fellow in the Latin toga, that's Jesus. Now, I don't think Jesus walked around in a Latin toga. I'm of Jewish extract. Jesus was Jewish extract too, a carpenter, and I don't think he's looking all Roman. But listen, it's the early 2nd century in Syria. What can I say? Roman Syria. So, he's kind of made into In fact, I remember once I was in Israel. I've been to Israel probably 50 times in Nazareth. There's a beautiful church there, a Catholic church. And all these different, the Catholic Church in these various countries pooled their resources together to do a mural of the Virgin Mary. And it was interesting. You can go and there's, the church from Korea. You go and you look at the Virgin Mary and you go, I think she looks a little Korean. And then, there's the church in Brazil. And you go, there, the Virgin Mary looks a little Brazilian. Personally, I think she was Jewish. I mean, that's just the way I roll. I think she comes from my tribe personally, but that's another story. But I get it. I can deal with the artistic evolution. But the point is, you're looking here at space where people gathered together, and central, I can't say central to what they're all about because I wasn't there to hear the speeches that were delivered underneath that. But at least visually, someone wants to put front and center to whoever's there the fact that, Jesus, if you look at being paralyzed, it's an intractable problem. It's a living death sentence. It's impossible. You just can't fix it. And someone wants to keep alive the memory that with him, there's just something about that name. Someone wants to keep alive and to promote within worship space. It seems to me that if I understand correctly, within worship space, someone wants to keep alive the transcendent. If you look at the world is not just difficult, it's profane, it's bombastic. And but the soul needs a place where it can find a little bit of rest, to carve out some space in a really trippy world that's marked by pain, disorientation, despair, and we're affected by it. Because sometimes the disorientation we experience is because of our own bad decisions. Other times, it's just because of the stuff that's sweeping onto our shores through our various webs of relationships. People can get out of kilter. To find a place in the world, some sanctuary. If you look at early Genesis, you haven't read 10 minutes into the Bible till you know something is horribly wrong on planet Earth. You haven't read 3 minutes into the Bible till you realize that there's, God had this place called paradise, and he had this concept called rest. It's called Sabbath. Well, when is the Sabbath? It's supposed to be Friday night or Saturday or Sunday. This church says, don't get hung up on the day, get hung up on the concept. The concept. And by the way, if you're in Israel today, and let's say there's a union that's on strike, there's placards, better wages. The word that they'll have on the placard where they're marching is the word Shabbat. It's just a word that means to cease working. Stop. Stop, it's what it means. It's like God the traffic cop. Stop. And rest. It's so central. Now, you bump right into it, when you begin the Bible. That tells me that people might need that. A resting place for the heart, place to come, a little piece of Eden, just a place where we're family again, brothers and sisters. It's not about how much money I do have or don't have, how good looking I am, I ain't, or this, my job. It doesn't matter. It's a place where we come and the kind of hierarchical structures of who's good and who's better and who's best that exist in the prevailing culture, all that stuff collapses in a world where in some sense, because of Jesus Christ, we're all children of God, we're all family, there's no longer Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free. Now there are Jews, hi, there are non-Jews, hello, there are the rich and the poor, but the point is it doesn't matter. A society of equals, an egalitarian world where people can breathe a little, love a little, live a little, reconnect with other human beings and with God. Now, it seems to me that that's adjudged to be very important, if for no other reason, because you bump into it as soon as you open up the Bible. And as soon as you hear Jesus Christ talk about worship, it's, hey, listen, it's not simply about sticks or bricks, it's about this spirit. I think these people got it, whoever painted that. I think these people got it, whoever painted that. I think these people got it, whoever did that. And here's another one too, women coming to adore Jesus. Remember, in the Gospels, the women come, he's dead, they think it's all over, but they love him, so they come bearing gifts. And if you look at the arms, some of the frescoes have been lost, things are corrupted, but it's just everywhere in literature. Now, what I want to do is look at a piece of text. I have 10 minutes left. I want to go to what I referred to earlier as the Odes of Solomon, and with that, you're not hearing canonical literature. Well, why bother talking about it then? Well, what you're hearing here is the voice of those who were earliest to the Jesus experience. And the question is there any way that we can perhaps understand that from looking at literature in what's referred to as the sub-apostolic era, right around the turn of the first century? You weren't there, I wasn't there. Is there a way to reconstruct what happened there? That's what you do if you're a detective, by the way. If you're a cop, I've done it. There's a murder. I'm sorry to give a gory scene. There's a murder. I wasn't there. But I'm beckoned to go there as a police officer. There's shell casings. There's a body. There's blood splatter. Now, again, I'm not trying to gross you out when I'm doing so good with behaving myself. My wife would be so proud. But the point is, for me, you go there as a police officer. You weren't there, but what it is you look closely at what is there and you come up with a tentative hypothesis based on the evidence about what happened there and who did it. You weren't there, but by looking closely, can you reconstruct what happened there? You come up with a tentative hypothesis, you send carpet samples out, hair samples out, under the fingernails if there was a fight to see if what it is you see if you come up with a tentative hypothesis, then you send out things for material testing and see if it corroborates your hypothesis. If it does, you bundle it together, you have what's called probable cause, specific and articulable facts, and you take that to the grand jury. You weren't there, but you're trying to reconstruct from was there. Now, I wasn't in century 1. I was not in a catacomb. I was not in the Dura Europa church. But what I'm trying to do is reconstruct based on testimony from those who were. Now here we're listening to literal testimony. Again, this is James Charlesworth. He is a professor, a chair of the Department of New Testament, Princeton University. And what I want to do is just look at 2 of these odes. These are songs, it's a hymnal. I don't know the melody associated with it. All I have are the words. Ode 21. I raised my arms on high on account of the grace of the Lord. Okay, so it's raising the voice, raising the arms, Lord, thank you. Somehow that stimulates this. He says in verse 4 then, and again, there's actually 9 verses, but I'm only interested in the 4th. He says, and even I myself acquired members. In them there was no sickness or affliction or suffering. It seems this person who's particularly thankful, there's some kind of miracle component associated with their wellspring of enthusiasm for things religious. They've been delivered from something. And he gives voice to the fact that there's some kind of sickness, affliction, or suffering that's somehow associated with the divine in worship, presumably, that somehow, by virtue of association with Jesus, it looks like this person found some biblical medicine for life's assorted hurts. People say, well, miracles, Jesus did that, the disciples did that, but went out of vogue with the disciples. Okay, you're right, mister, but no one told the person who wrote this in 100 AD. I would argue that the early Christians, not just on the basis of this one text, they actually happen to believe the stories, that if the divine has come into the world, don't think he's going to leave it the way he found it. And that's true of us. It's not just that he comes in the world in general, he comes into our world in particular. Now, here this person gives voice. He says, listen, I lift my hands on high. He says, I've acquired new members, sickness and all that. This person was able to get the better of that. I'm not saying everybody does, but he's saying he does. I'm interested in Ode 27, and what I want to do is look at this orant motif again, but I want to push it a little further. Once again, there's 3 verses here. I'll do them all. Well, no, actually there's 4. The last one is just the word hallelujah. We sung that. He says, or she says, I don't know whether him or her that wrote it. Bad habit, just always say he said. I extended my hands and hallowed my Lord. If I understand sacred space, in the New Testament economy, it's entering in, it's space in the world where there's felicity, there's peace, there's a recovery of equilibrium, there's worship, love, and within that context, well, parenthetically, someone could say, well, if that's what it is, Jeffrey, what do we need a building for? What do you need a building for if it's just about those associations? Well, don't ask me, ask a turtle. I wanted to come up with a family crest. And I told my boys, I just had boys. I told them I wanted to come up with a family crest, like the medieval people do. That's what happens when you're in out of England all the time. Well, what do you want? A lion? A jaguar? No, a turtle. A nice coat of arms with a turtle. And of course, sons, Dad, that is so stupid. Why do you want a turtle? Because every turtle knows that you can't get anywhere in life unless you're willing to stick your neck out. And I think it's important to be willing to roll the dice and take a little bit of risk. But the point is, if you look at a turtle, the turtle is that organism with the head and the feet and all that, but it needs a shell to live in. Whatever Grace Church is, it's not a location on a freeway. Church is the associations of people. This is just the shell. And as the little turtle grows, so does the shell. It's just part of the organic process. It just is what it is. That it needs a shell to dwell in. And keep in mind, when you're looking at the catacombs, they were looking for a place to meet underground. If you look at Dura Europa, Syria, they're looking for a place to meet above ground. The whole Jesus story, it's a team sport. You come to Jesus as an individual, you and I, and we can talk about our personal relationship with Jesus. It begins there, but it doesn't stay there. Because there's something innate, there's something significant, that the whole Jesus story, it has to do with our relationship with others. Jesus said, you want to call yourself pious? Well, if you do it to one of the least of these brethren, you do it unto me. I agree with St. Augustine, who said if someone doesn't have a church as their mother, they probably don't have God as their father. Might be a tad bit overstated, but the point is, it's a team sport, it's communal. And they gathered together, and here as I'm finishing, I raised my hands, hallowed my Lord. The expansion of my hands is his sign. And here's the point I want to push. And my extension is, what were they thinking of when they were praying like this? You and I and we, oh Lord, I'm healing. I'm not trying to disparage that. Help me, Lord, I'm lonely. I need to find a mate. I mean, God bless. Lord, I need $1. My job. I'm having trouble at work. I mean, we take that stuff to the Lord. But I want to add something here, at least from their voice. I extend my hands and hallow my Lord. For the expansion of my hands is his sign, and my extension is the upright cross. What were they thinking of when they were praying like this? They were thinking about the person that died on that. That's what they were thinking about. But there they are. It's not just Jesus, it's Christian, that is Christ-like. It's me too. It's Lord, I give myself to you. There's the component here of picking up the cross and following. Well, sacred space. What I wanted to do this morning, and thank you for going with me on the journey. I got a feeling that you did. That, sometimes, people just kind of check out, but I kind of had a feeling we were kind of tracking the same direction, and it means a lot to me. I mean that sincerely. Of course, if I didn't mean it sincerely, I'd probably still say it anyway, but I really do mean it. Yeah, I really do mean it. What I endeavored to do this morning was take a look at sacred space in sacred literature. Now, I kind of did a journey in the Older Testament, quick on the New Testament, and I kind of expanded sacred literature. Not canonical sacred, but I think the Odes of Solomon are sacred in the sense that it's kind of holy stuff. It gives you a window. And I hope that you derive some benefit from it. Never mind the nice lady with the hands extended. As I close, I wanted to, here's the sacred. Here's what I'm going to end with, and I'm just about done, you can tell. But another picture of an orant. You can see the space in the box, an ancient picture, praying. It's not a woman here, it's a man. And I just want you to see the commonality of that. But never mind the woman, things divine. When I think of sacred space, it's easy to contrast sacred and secular. But in our case, it's not just that culture is secular, it's that it's bombastic. Absolutely bombastic. Personally, I think that if the Founding Fathers were alive today, or if I think they're turning over in their graves right now, never mind alive today. I think it's just so far, and it's a little scary. And it's easy just to get disoriented. But, the people that painted that were living in a world kind of sort of like our very own. Their political situation was kind of tough. As I close, I'm reminded of Augustine, who, when he wrote, the Roman civilization was dissolving. At the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine wanted to unify the empire and stave off its decline. And he had what he describes as a religious experience. His son Constantinus carried on with Christian experience and pressed it in culture. His son Julian, when he came to power, he pivoted away from any kind of Christian agenda. He died in battle. When Theodosius came to power as the emperor, he pressed this Christian agenda, and there was a lot of optimism in culture that maybe we can, the glory days that were Rome are going to manifest through the Christian push. What happened, however, as Augustine writes his classic piece, The City of God, Alaric, the Goth, has invaded Rome, and the city's been overrun. The capital city of Rome itself had fallen. Of course, administrative structures were Ravenna and elsewhere, but the symbolism of that. And as Augustine wrote The City of God, his parish in North Africa, in Hippo, was under siege, close to falling as well. Now, I'm not here to advocate for Augustine, but what he was wanting to articulate, seeing the problems in human experience, he wanted to cast a vision for what he called the City of God, with the belief that difficulties notwithstanding, cultures come and go, but the city of God's purpose is going to be established here as it is in heaven. And that was 1,600 years ago. If you look at the Jesus people, the Jesus story, if you look at the people that painted that picture, they didn't have anything going for them. They didn't have money, they didn't have power, they were so pressed, repressed, depressed, you name it, pressed to the core, thrown under the bus. They didn't have anything but a prayer. But guess what? Apparently that prayer was good enough. Because those civilizations that oppressed them, they're not around. But the people that were telling that story about sacred space, they've been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Come hell or high water. One time the boss said, invest in the kingdom of God. He said, the gates of hell will not prevail. He doesn't say they won't assail. He says they won't prevail. Sometimes there's a bit of a fight. Thank you so much for affording me the opportunity to go on a little journey with you today. I hope that you're strengthened in your faith, that you're more minded to see value in this experience that we share together called Christianity, and I hope you fall even more in love with what's happening here, because it seems to me that some of what I shared in my talk is reflective in the community that I worshiped in today. Thank you so much. God bless you, Pastor. Thank you for the time.